He is risen. I gave you enough time there to respond with your He is risen indeed, and I hope you were able to do that. Happy Easter to you. I'm not going to primarily preach from the Gospel of Luke this morning, but I do want to read Luke's account of Jesus, part of Jesus' resurrection, so that you'll have an Easter Gospel story read to you. But in chapter 24 of Luke, beginning with verse 13, we read, "Now the same day 2 of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, 'What are you discussing together as you walk along?' They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, 'Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened these days?' 'What things?' he asked. 'About Jesus of Nazareth,' they replied. 'He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it is the 3rd day since all that took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him.' He said to them, 'How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?' And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?'" Well, for our Easter Sunday reflections, let me offer a few verses from 1 Corinthians 15. The 15th chapter presents the Apostle Paul's own thoughts on death and resurrection, his own Easter sermon, you might say. And I'm going to read there beginning with verse 19. "If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive, but each in turn. Christ, the firstfruits. Then when he comes, those who belong to him, and then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. If it is only for this life that we have hope in Christ, well, that would be rather pitiful, as Paul says. A week or so ago, there were a few days when one of my social media timelines filled up with people responding to somebody's question that went like this: if Jesus was not actually bodily raised from the dead, how much would that matter to you? And of course, because the goal on social media is to be as shrill as you possibly can be, there were plenty of really chippy answers. On one side, people saying things like, well, if Jesus was not bodily raised to life, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd cheat and steal and start killing people. I'd lose all motivation for moral living, which seems a little problematic, I think. Because there are people around us now who don't believe in the resurrection or even Jesus, and they still manage to live decent, caring lives. And we're happy that they do. We're happy that they're not killing us, right? I just think it's not a good look for Christians when they appear to be worse than the atheists and agnostics. And then, of course, there were respondents on the other side, some who claim the label Christian, but who don't really believe in the bodily resurrection. For them, it's more like, Jesus came back to life in the consciousness of his followers or something like that. And these tended to respond, yes, I'd still believe, I'd still have this faith, because the real meaning of Easter doesn't have to do with the historicity of it all, but in the teachings of Jesus, which never die, which is problematic too, because that doesn't seem to be what the first Christians meant when they said he has risen, nor does it account for the witness of the early church. I mean, are we supposed to believe that the first Christians were willing to lay down their lives because they had had the experience of Christ as if resurrected? Really? How many people do you know that die for a metaphor, right? It's interesting that we just think we're so sophisticated today with all of our hot takes on things, but even a surface reading of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians shows that these things were being debated back then, 2,000 years ago, and without cell phones. All kinds of did it really happen questions, and if it did happen, how does it matter questions were floating around the ancient Mediterranean world after Easter. Was Jesus really raised from the dead? And if he was given a new bodily life, then what would be the ramifications of that? Well, in this 15th chapter of that letter, which deals specifically with those kinds of questions, Paul shows that he is decidedly on team bodily resurrection, right? He believes, first of all, in the historicity, the factualness of the bodily resurrection of Christ. And then secondly, he's convinced that the resurrection is an event that changes everything. The good news of Christ's resurrection is where you start. It's where it started for him personally. Just to recap his life a little bit, as a young man, Paul was a committed follower of Torah, the biblical instructions, and he thought that his duty to Israel's God was to purge the pure faith of the Christian heresy. These Jesus followers within the Jewish community who were saying that an itinerant prophet and healer who had been crucified and then raised back to life was Israel's true king. An absurd and dangerous idea. And Paul committed himself to eradicating those who were spreading the lie. Until one day, while heading to Damascus, just out on another purge, he met the resurrected Christ. Christ alive, Christ in all his glory, Christ appearing as pure light, stopped Paul in his tracks, called him by name, dropped him to his knees. And when I say stopped him in his tracks, I mean it both physically and metaphorically. Stopped him as in ended the trip, but that experience also affected what would end up being a 180-degree turnaround in Paul's life. Life as he had known it came to an end, and when his eyes, which were temporarily blinded by the light, when they finally opened, they looked upon a new reality, a world made alive by the Spirit. The new began for Paul. And soon he was back at work again, as zealous as before, but now sharing the message that he had previously tried to stamp out, the good news of Christ raised from the dead. The rest of his life, all his mission work, every letter he wrote, every argument he engaged, fed off of this pivotal event. Basically one sermon in his sermon folder for the rest of his life. Wonder what I should preach today. Well, how about this? My only sermon, I'll preach it. Jesus raised from the dead. He lived this message. He called others to believe it and to live by it. And in the end, he died for it. So don't be surprised at all by what Paul writes in this letter. If only for this life does Easter matter? If Easter is diminished in any way by saying it didn't happen, or is diminished by saying if it did happen, it only applies to the short span of our lives, well, if it's reduced to that, then Paul says, shame on us. We're just pitiful dreamers of a fantasy. But it is not just for that. Verse 20 starts off with a big but, no jokes, please. Paul writes, after saying that, if only for this life, he then writes, but Christ indeed has been raised from the dead. And that is indeed raised language here has the sense that you might imagine that it has. Paul's is indeed means really. Since Christ really is raised from the dead. And I notice one translator of this passage puts it this way: Christ is, capital I-S, raised from the dead. And that works too. And whatever else Paul has to say works off of this first affirmation. And you might wonder how Paul can be so sure of the bodily resurrection of Jesus since he wasn't one of the original disciples. But as I've already mentioned, he knows because of his own experience. He met the resurrected Lord, and the Lord continues to fill him and lead him. The miracles of his ministry certainly don't come from a dead Jesus. He sees evidence of the living Christ every day. And then secondly, his path is crossed with plenty of others who were there with Jesus originally and then with the resurrected Jesus. At the beginning of chapter 15, Paul lists out some of the individuals and groups who were witnesses, and they all tell the same story. And the reports to him are compelling. So, with great confidence, he can affirm he is risen. Now, it all starts there, but it doesn't end there. The first fact of Christian faith has implications. It sort of unfolds and changes things. Think about why we worship today. I mean, what is it about Easter? What are we doing? We don't celebrate it so that we'll have some way to wear our pastel clothing that otherwise would stay in the closet. We don't celebrate Easter for the eggs and the ham and then the Monday ham sandwiches. We don't even worship on Easter just to say, oh, wow, so this happened. Isn't that amazing? And then move on as if we were done. No, we sing and pray and remember because the fact of the resurrected Christ changes for us, just as it did for Paul, everything. The old, sinful, broken, corrupt world comes to an end in Easter. A new world begins at Easter, and we inhabit it. In his next letter to the church in Corinth, Paul will engage this theme a little more directly. 2 Corinthians, particularly chapter 5. He'll talk about how God is in Christ reconciling the world, a prodigal world, wandering since the time of Adam. God is through Christ reconciling this prodigal world to himself. It's being put back into good shape through Christ. In our reading today, Paul pits Christ up against Adam. Adam is the story of the old world. In Adam, things fall apart. Death comes about. At Christ's resurrection, though, death gets undone. Christ lives, and the wider implication of that is that anyone in Christ gets caught up in God's renovation of creation. Again, in Paul's next letter to the Corinthians, he'll say, for anyone who is in Christ, new creation has come. It's a beautiful, transformative vision of both present and future. New creation has been unleashed. We're here in it. It sounds wonderful. Until we get home and flip on CNN or Fox News or Newsmax or MSNBC or Al Jazeera. Did I hopefully covered everybody there? We turn on the news and we get images of a gutted Ukrainian city with civilian bodies still in the street, or a guy shoots up people in a subway car, or there's a new spike in the virus, or it happens in our personal lives. We learn of the divorce of a friend, or someone that we've cared about has relapsed and died, or the tests have come back and are not good. Sometimes it's like, okay, if this is new creation, tell me again how it's different from old creation. Paul's completely committed to the good news of the resurrection and that something wonderful is unfolding. He believes that the resurrection indeed launches new creation. He believes that Christ now sits enthroned as King of heaven and earth. He believes that the world inaugurated at the empty tomb will one day be realized fully and completely. It is for him a trajectory that is completely trustworthy. You can count on it. This is what's happening. But he is careful in how he presents this good news. You might need to be a farmer or a gardener to get it. Paul says, Jesus is the first fruits, the first bit of the harvest, a sign of the fullness that is to come. Imagine a farmer taking me out into his field sometime next few weeks, and he takes me out there and he says, "It looks pretty good, doesn't it?" And I say, "Looks good, whatever. I don't see a thing. Looks like a barren field to me." And the farmer gets a little irritated. "Don't see a thing? What's wrong with you, city boy?" And indeed I am a city boy. You know, Columbus Urban, 4th Street gang, all that stuff. But the farmer, he puts his hand on the back of my neck and pushes my head down toward the soil, and he says, "You can't see that? What? That tiny little green, those tiny little sprouts there?" And the farmer says, "Son, if you're standing in this spot a few months from now, nobody's going to be able to see you. You're going to be dwarfed by corn that's 10 feet tall. This field is headed that way, as sure as the world. You're just too dumb to see what's happening." I think Paul is sort of like the farmer. He knows the power of seeds planted. He knows that the Jesus who was planted in the grave didn't stay there, but came out of the soil. He sees for himself how that story of resurrection changes the people who hear it and believe it. He has no problem imagining that this good news will spread everywhere and affect every place that he goes. He believes the good news of the resurrection will reach every broken corner of the world and in a final miracle of God be brought to wholeness. There will be bumps along the way because where things are going isn't present yet. We haven't arrived. And Paul faced more than his share of trouble in life. In the end, he was killed for what he believed, but he never stopped believing it, never stopped seeing where it was going. Do you know what I hope our Easter conjures up? I hope it helps create people who can see the inevitable new creation without getting bogged down in the undergrowth of old broken creation. If you have farmer eyes, you can see the sprouts and what they promise. It's coming. We look out, we see horror in Ukraine, but then look, I see a sprout. There's our friends, Jacob and Kendra in Austria, giving life back to refugees, moving them on toward safe places, taking care of them for a few nights. A little bit of new growth in the barren field. Or I see, wow, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch justifies Putin and condemns the genocide that's taking place. It's horrible. And yet, there are priests both inside and outside of Russia who are speaking out strongly against their boss at great cost. A little sprout there. Or I think of our young Thomas Rice, a kid with plenty to think about, but you know what he wants right now? What he wants is for us to get the new building up and running, the new renovation of the sanctuary take place, so he can be the first one that's baptized in the renovated new room, you know, buried in the water, sprouting up to a new life. How else is the good news of the resurrection unfolding? Well, if you've got your eyes adjusted properly, you'll see all these bits of evidence pointing to the fact that in the end, Jesus gets his way. No more death. We live. It is not only for this life that we hope. That's what Easter says.